Good morning. It's been a couple of weeks since I last put together a session, a teaching, and it's been time well spent. I need downtime to kind of reflect, and what this downtime has done for me. Last I spoke, I shared about my personal experience with clarity, the search for clarity, and titled the episode, Clarity is Not Sustainable. And I put in the same category as bliss. Because the infinite, the all, the everything, the nothing that is everything, the everything that is nothing, any one of those works, strangely enough. But when I was talking about sustaining clarity, I really wasn't clear about how I looked at clarity. And I'll go into explaining this now. 30 plus. I want to say closer to 40, but that makes me out to be a slow study. 30's long enough to stick with something only to ultimately find, surprise, surprise, that it didn't work. Or it wasn't what I thought, it wasn't what it seemed. But I hadn't really the clarity that I was searching for, because I'm habitually in a muddled state. I've always blamed it on being a Pisces. But I don't know if that's a fair blame. If any fellow Pisces are listening out there or watching, want to object, feel free. But in my experience, and that's all I can speak to, is that confusion, bordering on chaos, well, many times, a lot of the time, probably more time than I care to admit. But this state made me always yearn for clarity. And all those years I was searching for it in all the wrong places, using methodology, and as I'm talking about Zen teaching, and I'm talking about my acceptance of Raja Yoga, the search to still, to quiet, still, and ultimately, as I understood it, to silence, and that the silence would somehow be filled with clarity, a clarity that wasn't available until I quieted the mind. Not only what I call the greater mind, the mind that's useful in helping, assisting me to determine what's not so. Totally useless for determining what's so, but a useful tool. And this tool in the jhana yoga, the tradition of information to knowledge, to ultimately to blossom into wisdom. I needed this greater mind. This greater mind was a tool that existed while looking around, there weren't many other tools available to me. And as we know, to get a job done, we need tools. And the more sophisticated, the more applicable the tools are, the easier, better, or the results or consequences. So it seemed counterintuitive to me to try to shut down a tool that I had and to have to transcend that to enjoy the much sought after clarity, to see things so clearly as if gazing down a still pond and being able to see the pebbles and the plants and the fishes swimming within the water. To be able to see this clearly. This was my idea for all those years. This is what I was seeking. I wanted to be clear. But what I didn't get, and I guess it's never, I'm testament, if anything, to it's never too late. I came to understand, an epiphany, it was just, the light came on. The clarity that I was seeking is clarity of mind, mental clarity, acumen. This was what I sought. And the kind of clarity somehow that would lead to surety. I'm sure this is right. Well, that in itself should have been a clue, because if there's one thing that I have learned in my 70 years of wandering this globe, has been that whatever I felt sure of, whether a brief surety or a long time held surety, didn't matter. The nature of the surety didn't matter. Short term, long term, mid-term, briefly sure. One thing I can say is that it's hard to say that mostly sure. Sure seems to be like an on-off. Sure or you're not. Mostly sure. As I was listening to Adyashanti, he talked about the nature of on and off by bringing up pregnancy. You can't be a little pregnant. You can't be partly pregnant. So you are or you're not. So so clarity, and the clarity that I was always seeking was to be clear mentally, to see things clearly without the fog. I mentioned before, and I better mention it again, my family name is Hayes, Hayes, and it rhymes with haze, Haze. The day outside is hazy. So I'm aptly named because this fog. If there's been a constant in my life, the constancy of the fog, confusion, has been a big part of who and what I am. And now I've come to see it that it's just so. It's not a good thing or a bad thing, it's just so. But I do believe confusion, not having ironclad convictions or ideas has been a blessing. It's left me open. And I think out of this confused state, the drive to search for answers predominated. Probably if I would have been sure. See, I'm not sure. There's a perfect example. But probably, I imagine that if I would have been more clear about things, that I wouldn't have had such a questioning nature. And this questioning served me well. It was ultimately this questioning that I had tried to suppress, tried to ignore in my attempts to still silence my mind. In particular, the monkey mind, because it's just constant companion. Seldom do I not feel its presence. But the amazing thing about it is that when it's not there, it leaves room for peace. And I've always been so much appreciating the state of peace, the state of grace, that I didn't even notice the monkey mind was silent. Still there, but not chattering. So I've told you before that it was in the process, as I was evaluating my long-time efforts of silencing, of achieving silence. As I was evaluating it and really hit home that it wasn't working. Previously, I thought it was on me. I wasn't trying hard enough. No matter how diligent, no matter how much I adhered to a very rigorous practice, even in my meditation, full lotus, and if couldn't maintain that, at least half lotus. Straight spine. So much energy put into the form that left little room at times to observe the formless. In my practice, I had one monk who had ambitions of being a Roshi tell me that meditation is like going to war. You're supposed to fight. You should be sweating. Well, that never set well. But I have to say, it could have been the novice's enthusiasm to impart impact on a lesser novice, because I've never had a Roshi tell me anything similar. If they ever said anything, it was more in line with what meditation seemed to me. And it's just being. I would say just be. But to me, just be is a stagnation. It's an unsustainable state. Because life is movement. So I add the ing, being, a state of being. And I stick with that. If I had to define meditation, it's appreciating your momentary state of being. But the key here is the unescapable, unavoidable assumption on my part that clarity indeed was synonymous with clarity of mind. Because it didn't even dawn on me that it could be anything else. So much a part of my life was my mind. Didn't even dawn on me. All I looked is to my own shortcomings. I have to be more rigorous, more dedicated, try harder. When my nature, and this is all counter my nature, because I'm much closer to not trying than I am to trying. So I was forcing like a round peg in a square hole. And it's only been in the last, I guess, 8 years about when I realized that what I knew, the jhana yoga, while a fine tradition, was not suitable for me. And jhana yoga, even though I'd always been practicing it with a smaller voice, my emphasis was on form, discipline. My emphasis was on everything that I wasn't. And my practice now, if I had to give any advice, and I do it guardedly, because I'd much rather support everyone's effort to find out what's so for them. I certainly didn't really listen to any outside advice. I sort of knew that it was always up to me. But effectively, there's 4 yogas. Well, there's the yoga of the body, but 4 yogas that lend themselves to being a platform of exploration to your spiritual, for your spiritual self. So karma, that's actions and deeds. Bhakti, love and devotion, chanting, worshipping a guru, not worshipping, but listening, attending a practice guided through the graces of a guru. And then Raja, what they call the royal path. This is the path of ultimately silencing the mind with the intention of attaining clarity. And then jhana yoga, the yoga of knowledge, the yoga for a thinker. So questions from I remember asking my mom at 2 or 3, can people fly? She says, no, son, people can't fly. But I was flying in my dreams. I had vivid memories of flying in my dreams. But once I put the question out there to my mom, despite her best intentions, she said, no, son, people don't fly. Well, I never flew again. But previous to it being negated, it was in the realm of possibilities for me. So this was the beginning of questions. And it was ironic that these questions continued. I was quite the questioner until I found my teacher. And I found that the questions had disappeared. From a man of many questions, I no longer had a question. And even now, my teacher, I was fortunate enough to have 8 or 10 or 12 opportunities to meet with him privately. And he was always end our talks with asking, do I have any questions? And here's, if I ever had an opportunity, pretty close to the source, as close as I'd ever found up to in the physical form up to date. And I was, I guess, 60, past 60, 61, 62. So all those years, finally I have someone that might, for the first time, be qualified to give me answers. Yet I found myself saying to him, no, I have no questions. And it was through this that I realized that not only didn't I have questions for him, but I had questions for no one or anything. The questions had just somehow dried up. And I think part of understanding this is instead of having questions, seeking answers, I instead develop, or I instead evolved to the point where first the questions dried up, completely gone, completely dried up. And it took a while. It took a while for me to realize this, and again, reinforced by having an opportunity to ask my teacher. Then I really knew if I had no questions for him, I would have no questions whatever. And what I want to stress here is that it's not that I had the answers. Quite the contrary. What I was experiencing is a reversal. Instead of asking a question verbally, I was in the process of questioning any answers that I may have taken from some source, or, God forbid, develop myself. So I turned it on its head, so to speak. Instead of asking questions in the hope, and the vain hope, as I've come to understand, that someone, somewhere, can answer them. Now my reflections, my examinations, my pondering was upon answers. I sought out every answer in every little nook and cranny that I had stored anywhere within, and brought it forward to the higher mind to critique, evaluate, and ultimately discard. Isn't it interesting that to be a questioning nature, and then the answers that I did get, either through self-examination, through any outside source, through reading, through the words of a guru, through the spiritual, any source, I sought out and started the process of questioning. This, of course, is an inner dialogue versus an outer dialogue of expressing, formulating, expressing, probably saving, storing up, sorting, attempting to manage questions. The whole process really makes me laugh. I find it very amusing. So in this process of internal dialogue, internal process of questioning any answers, well, it didn't take long to start to see a pattern that the answers didn't hold up. It just brought me right back to where that my opportunity to listen to an elderly Korean Zen monk in Hawaii, at the University of Hawaii, when he asked the professors and the scholars and the students in the amphitheater, he asked one question: who is I, me, my? And as you can imagine, in an academic environment, convoluted, long answers. To the point where sometimes people are saying they're asking questions or answering questions, and it's more, seems to me, it turns out to be more of an exercise of hearing themselves. But after every answer, he patiently listened. He said, I'd hit you with this stick. He had a staff. I'd hit you with this stick. And this went on for about 45 minutes, because there's anything a scholar is uncomfortable about is unanswerable questions, accepting that they didn't have an answer. It seemed counterintuitive to everything they envisioned themselves as scholars. Scholars are here to ascertain, to find, to answer questions. Science is solely an attempt to answer questions. What's the explanation? Why? And the old man finally said, he put us out of our misery. He finally said, don't know. And it echoes, don't know. Don't know. He said, I don't know. He didn't say, I don't know, because his question is, who is I, me, my? Don't know. And at the time, it took me many years to process, but at that time, in that simple statement, don't know, lies the condition of us as human beings. Don't know. Well, any answers that I might have been entertaining, no matter how deeply I had buried them, everything was a process of digging it up. And I ended up not seeing the answers as any more meaningful, maybe even less meaningful, because at least questions serves a purpose. It starts the process. But obtaining answers, holding on to answers, thinking that you know, well, turns out to be, that's hilarious. So, don't know is my mantra, which is supported by let it go. The seeking, the striving, the search for answers that are not ultimately not answerable. Accepting the beauty of don't know. And learning to let everything go. The lightness that comes. And this is the beginning of living in a state of grace. Questioning is gone. Accept, and even questioning the answers because you've discarded them in the face of don't know. So the clarity that I sought for so many years was clarity of mind. And I evolved over all these years to accept, reconcile, and ultimately embrace that I can't know, that I don't know, and let all of that go. And only then did I see the clarity that they were talking about, the clarity, the bliss that's constant. Awareness is clear. Awareness has uninterrupted clarity, uninterrupted bliss. So the clarity, unknown to me probably at the time, not consciously anyway, the clarity that I was talking about that was elusive, I couldn't sustain, was mental clarity. But the statement rings true because I've learned, as I've mentioned, that I can touch on bliss, but it's not sustainable. I can't keep in my body. And I believe, I hate that word, but I've come to know that clarity, this spiritual clarity, the clarity of awareness, is not sustainable at this point. I don't know how to reconcile, I don't know how to keep in the physical form, either with bliss or clarity. Maybe that distance can be a good thing.